The neon lights of Richmond, Virginia, flickered against the rain-slicked streets. Inside a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city, Ethan Walker sat alone at the counter, nursing a glass of whiskey. He was a man who blended into the background, broad-shouldered but unassuming, his sharp blue eyes hidden beneath the shadow of a worn-out baseball cap. To the people in this bar, he was just another quiet stranger. No one knew that Ethan was once a Delta Force operator, a ghost of the battlefield who had carried out missions the government would never admit existed. After years of war, he had chosen a peaceful life with his wife, Claire Walker, a dedicated nurse at a local hospital. They had built a life away from violence, a world where no one feared his name. But some men mistook silence for weakness. At a corner table, a group of men laughed loudly. Their leader, Vince Morello, was a man who thrived on power. A mid-level Mafia enforcer, Vince ruled these streets with arrogance. He was the kind of man who never backed down, a predator who enjoyed the taste of fear in others. Tonight, Vince was restless. His usual entertainment, threatening weak men and seducing women, felt stale. That's when his eyes landed on Claire, who had just entered the bar, searching for her husband. Ethan, unaware of the danger brewing behind him, took another sip of whiskey. Tonight, everything would change. The bar hummed with low chatter and the clinking of glasses. Ethan Walker remained at the counter, quietly savoring his whiskey. His trained instincts caught shifts in the room, the way people moved, the rise and fall of voices. But tonight, he ignored them. He wasn't in a war zone anymore. At the entrance, Claire Walker spotted her husband and walked toward him, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. She barely noticed the hungry gaze from the dark corner of the bar. Vince Morello, leaned forward, his smirk widening. "Who's that?" he muttered to his crew, nodding toward Claire. One of his men, Marco, whistled under his breath. "She's something else, boss." Vince chuckled. "Yeah, and she just walked into my bar like she owns the place." Claire reached Ethan, placing a hand on his shoulder. He turned slightly, his face relaxing at the sight of her. "Hey," she said softly. "You didn't answer my text. Everything okay?" Ethan gave her a small smile. "Just unwinding." Behind them, Vince stood up. Claire was a woman who had been around enough to recognize the wrong kind of attention. She felt it creeping up her spine before she even turned to look. Ethan noticed the slight tension in her posture. His body stiffened, instincts kicking in. Vince strolled over, his arrogance dripping from every step. His men followed close behind, watching like hyenas circling prey. "Now, what do we have here?" Vince said, voice smooth but laced with danger. He ignored Ethan completely, his eyes locked onto Claire. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. The first mistake had just been made. The air in the bar grew thick with tension as Vince Morello strutted toward the couple, his expensive shoes tapping against the wooden floor. The laughter from his table had died down. His men leaned in, watching. They knew their boss. Ethan Walker didn't turn, but he knew exactly how many steps Vince had taken. 4 more steps. That's all it would take for the situation to escalate. Claire felt it too. She subtly shifted closer to Ethan, her fingers grazing his arm. A silent signal. Ethan had spent years in combat. He could sense the shift in her breathing, the slight rigidity in her shoulders. She was uncomfortable. Vince finally reached them. He ignored Ethan entirely and leaned slightly toward Claire, flashing his signature cocky grin. "Didn't think I'd see a woman like you in a place like this," Vince said smoothly. His voice was laced with the kind of arrogance that came from years of getting his way. Ethan exhaled slowly, keeping his focus on the whiskey glass in front of him. He wasn't looking for a fight. Not here. Not now. Claire didn't smile. She had dealt with men like Vince before. Predators who thought charm and power could bend people to their will. "I'm here with my husband," she said, her tone polite but firm. Vince chuckled, glancing at Ethan. "This guy?" He let out an amused scoff. He saw no threat, just some quiet, unremarkable man at the bar. Ethan finally moved, slowly, deliberately. He picked up his whiskey glass, took a sip, and set it down again. Then he turned his head just slightly to look at Vince. For the first time, Vince paused. There was something in Ethan's eyes, something cold, something measured. But arrogance was a dangerous thing. Vince ignored the instinct telling him to back off. Instead, he smirked. "Relax, man. I was just saying hello to your wife." Claire stiffened. Ethan remained calm. Vince grinned again and, without warning, he reached out and touched Claire's arm. It was a mistake, a very big mistake. The entire bar fell silent. Ethan breathed in slowly. The war had been left behind. The violence, the missions, the battles, they were all supposed to be over. But now it was staring him in the face. Vince had no idea that the quiet man he had just disrespected had spent years eliminating high-value targets for the U.S. government. The storm was coming. The bar fell into absolute silence. The second Vince's fingers touched Claire's arm, it was as if the entire room had sensed something shift, something dangerous. Ethan didn't move immediately. He simply stared at Vince's hand, still resting on his wife's arm. His breathing was steady, too steady. Claire pulled her arm back sharply, her eyes flashing with controlled anger. "Don't touch me." Her voice was firm but low, her composure unshaken. Vince let out a small laugh, looking at his men as if to say, "You see this?" He turned back to Claire, still smirking. "Relax, sweetheart, I was just—" Crack. It happened faster than anyone could process. 1 second, Vince was talking. The next, Ethan's hand shot out, gripping Vince's wrist like a steel vice. The smirk vanished from Vince's face. The pressure on his wrist was immediate, bone-crushing. His grin faltered as he felt an unnatural force in Ethan's grip. Ethan's blue eyes locked onto Vince's, cold and emotionless. Controlled, measured. A look that belonged to a man who had seen and done things that should never be spoken about. Vince tried to yank his arm back, but he couldn't. The grip didn't budge. The few men at Vince's table started to rise, sensing the sudden turn. Marco, the closest of Vince's men, instinctively reached for his waistband, but Ethan's voice, low and deadly, cut through the bar. "Don't." It was a single word, but it carried the weight of something lethal. Marco froze. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way Ethan said it, like a man who would not hesitate. The bartender stepped back, looking between the men, knowing a fight was coming. Vince gritted his teeth, trying to act like his wrist wasn't about to snap. He hated being challenged, especially in front of his own men. "You need to let go of my hand, old man," Vince hissed, trying to twist free. Ethan's grip tightened. "Listen to me carefully," Ethan said, his voice quiet but filled with something that made the air feel heavier. "You put your hands on my wife." Vince winced slightly. Ethan had barely moved, but the pain was real. "You're going to step back," Ethan continued, his voice calm and precise, "and you're going to walk away." Vince scoffed through the pain, trying to save face. "Or what?" he spat. Ethan's expression didn't change. "Or I make you." The entire bar felt it, the moment before the storm. A silent, invisible countdown. And then Vince made his second mistake. With a snarl of frustration, he tried to yank his wrist free and took a swing. But Ethan was faster, much faster. Vince's punch never landed. Ethan moved fluidly, like a trained predator, redirecting the strike effortlessly. His grip shifted from Vince's wrist to his collar, and in one swift motion, slam! Vince's back hit the bar counter with a brutal force, glasses shattering around him. A grunt of pain escaped his lips as he struggled to process what had just happened. For the first time, his men looked uncertain. Ethan let go and stepped back, his face completely unreadable. "I gave you a choice," he said simply. Vince coughed, stumbling to his feet, his ego bruised more than his body. His face burned with humiliation. He had never been manhandled like that before. His eyes narrowed with fury. This wasn't over. This was just beginning. The bar remained dead silent. The weight of what had just happened still hung in the air like smoke. Vince was humiliated, slammed against the bar like he was nothing, in front of his own men. Ethan Walker stood unshaken, his expression unreadable, his stance relaxed, like a man who wasn't even slightly concerned about what would happen next. Vince clenched his jaw, wiping the corner of his mouth as if checking for blood. There was none. His chest rose and fell, rage boiling beneath his skin. No one had ever put their hands on him like that and lived to tell the story. Not in this city. Not anywhere. His men were watching, expecting him to do something, to retaliate. Marco, his most loyal enforcer, shifted his weight forward slightly, waiting for the word. Just one signal. One nod. Vince sucked in a breath, forcing a smirk back onto his face, trying to regain his composure, pretending like this wasn't a big deal. "All right, tough guy," Vince muttered, rolling his shoulders. His voice was smooth, but the tension in his jaw gave him away. He took a slow step toward Ethan, keeping his tone light. Too light. "You got some hands, I'll give you that," Vince said. "Not bad for an old man sitting in a bar with his wife." Ethan didn't react. Not even a flinch. Claire, still standing at the bar, could feel it. That storm inside her husband. Building. Not loud, not obvious. But it was there. And if Vince had any sense at all, he would have walked away. But he didn't. Instead, he let out a low laugh and tilted his head. "Tell you what," Vince continued, "how about we settle this like men? No hard feelings. We step outside, go one-on-one, and—" Ethan sighed quietly and reached for his glass, lifting it smoothly to his lips. He took a slow sip, then set the glass down without a sound. "No." Vince blinked. "No." Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bar. "No," he repeated. Calm. Icy. Final. Vince's smirk twitched. The entire bar was watching this unfold like a slow-moving train wreck. Marco, sensing where this was going, stepped in. "Vince," Marco muttered under his breath, "not here, not like this." But Vince wasn't listening. He was already too deep. His ego, his reputation, had already taken a hit. If he let this slide, if he let some random guy humiliate him in front of his own men, it would spread like wildfire. People would start doubting. People would start talking. And Vince Morello wasn't about to let that happen. Not now. Not ever. He took one last step toward Ethan. "You don't understand, buddy," Vince said, his voice lower now, colder. "I wasn't asking." Marco exhaled sharply, knowing this was a terrible idea. Vince reached inside his suit jacket, and before anyone could react, Ethan moved, faster than anyone at that bar had ever seen. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. 1 second, Vince's hand was reaching for something inside his jacket. The next, Ethan had him. A brutal twist, a shift of weight, and crack. Vince screamed, a sharp, brutal sound that echoed through the entire bar. Ethan had his arm bent at an unnatural angle, wrist twisted in a way it should never move, bone pressing against skin. Vince's knees buckled. He let out a strangled, pain-filled grunt, struggling to stay on his feet. The entire bar was frozen. Marco reached for his gun. Ethan's head snapped up, his ice-blue eyes locked onto Marco. "Don't." That single word, spoken so quietly but carrying so much weight. Marco froze. His instincts screamed at him. This man was not normal. Not some random bar patron, not some civilian. Something about the way Ethan had moved, the efficiency, the brutality. Marco knew without a shadow of a doubt. This man was a killer. The kind of man who didn't just fight to win, the kind of man who fought to eliminate. Suddenly, everything was clear. The way Ethan had moved, the absolute control. This man was trained, and not just trained, he was one of the best. Marco's breath hitched, his fingers hesitated over his gun. He was afraid. For the first time in years, he was afraid. Ethan looked back down at Vince, who was trembling, teeth clenched in agony. He leaned in close, his voice so quiet only Vince could hear. "Walk away." Vince's face was contorted in pain, his body locked in absolute humiliation. He had lost. Completely. But worse than that, he had just learned a very, very dangerous truth. This wasn't some old man at a bar. This was a monster in disguise. And Vince had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The air inside the bar was suffocating. Vince Morello was still kneeling on the floor, his face pale from pain and humiliation. His wrist, twisted and useless, throbbed violently. But that pain was nothing compared to the fire raging inside him. He had just been publicly humiliated. By some nobody. His men weren't speaking, weren't moving. They were all waiting for his reaction. Marco, his most trusted enforcer, stood frozen, hand still hovering near his gun, but he knew better now. He wasn't dealing with an ordinary man. This was something else. Someone else. A man who had shattered Vince's ego with less effort than most people took to breathe. And he had done it without even looking angry. That's what made it worse. Ethan Walker, this nameless stranger, had just crippled a Mafia lieutenant in front of his own crew and hadn't even broken a sweat. Claire placed a gentle hand on Ethan's arm. It was a silent signal. We should go. Ethan understood. Without another word, he turned and reached for his glass, as if nothing had happened. Then he casually finished his drink. Vince felt his stomach twist. That bastard wasn't even taking him seriously. His fingers clenched into a trembling fist, his teeth ground together. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ethan set his empty glass on the bar and glanced at Claire. His voice was calm, smooth. Ready to go? Claire gave him a small nod, but she knew better than anyone. Her husband was still watching, calculating. The tension in the room was still thick, but Ethan wasn't tense at all. He was relaxed, unbothered, like a lion walking past a wounded hyena. Vince's eyes burned with hatred as Ethan placed a few bills on the counter. He wasn't paying for the drinks. He was paying for the damage. Then, with that same calm presence, Ethan walked toward the exit with Claire. No one stopped them. The only sound was the low hum of the bar's neon sign and the dull throb of music from the old jukebox in the corner. Vince watched them go, breathing heavily. He felt his pride bleeding out of him as the bar patrons whispered in hushed voices. This couldn't happen. This wouldn't happen. His vision blurred with fury as he finally pushed himself up, his injured wrist hanging uselessly at his side. He turned to Marco, his voice barely a whisper. "Find out who the hell that was." Marco didn't answer right away. He hesitated, just long enough for Vince to notice. That hesitation made his blood boil even more. "Did you hear me?" Vince snapped, his face twisted with rage. "I want him dead." Marco exhaled slowly before nodding. "I'll look into it." But in Marco's gut, he knew the truth. This was a terrible mistake.